Why do we fall, Bruce? So we can learn to pick ourselves up. That is a quote from the movie Batman Begins, and it's quite interesting how much that quote describes the history of Batman in the 2000s, a decade where the Batman mythos reached an all-time low of darkness and deconstruction, only to rise back up, embracing the light once again to conquer the world like never before. This is the fascinating era of Batman's greatest defeat and his ultimate victory. This is the downfall and comeback of Batman in the 2000s.
Are you ready to begin?
The 1990s was one of the most successful decades for Batman. Not only was the character incredibly popular thanks to the cinematic Batman franchise and the groundbreaking animated series, but the Batman comics were also thriving, with iconic and ambitious storylines all throughout the decade. The 90s was a great time to be a Batman fan, but by the end of the decade, things were not looking great for the Dark Knight detective. The Batman movies had reached a breaking point, and after a terrible disaster of a movie, the franchise was cancelled altogether. The animated series had also come to an end, and the follow-up series about a teenage Batman from the future, despite being good in its own right, could not reach the same levels of popularity. By the end of the 90s, Batman was slowly fading away from the mainstream media, but the Batman comics were closing the decade with a bang. Batman No Man's Land was the biggest, most ambitious storyline of the decade, and it followed the collapse and total destruction of Gotham City as Batman fights to bring back law and order in a dystopic version of Gotham. No Man's Land was the final Batman story of the 90s, and at the end of it all, the world entered a new millennium. The 2000s had begun, and DC started a new chapter in the Batman history called New Gotham. This was essentially a soft reboot of the Batman comics, where DC introduced all sorts of changes. Gotham City was finally brought back and fully rebuilt, but instead of the dark city of the 90s, it was reimagined as this modern and very bright metropolis. Gotham was no longer the city of fear, and instead it looked like a normal, modern city. Batman also abandoned the Batsuit with a yellow symbol on his chest that he had used for more than 3 decades, going back to basics with only a big black bat instead. The Batcave was also reimagined, as DC took the opportunity of remodeling the place and turned it into a futuristic base of operations with fantastic gadgets and flashy architecture, getting rid of the old trophies like the giant penny and the dinosaur. It was a new Batman for a new millennium, and part of these changes included a complete new direction for all the Batman comics. The main Batman title became the action-adventure series, with stories that were bright and lighthearted and with lots of action and superhero adventures. The series was designed for young readers, with very colorful and dynamic art by Scott McDaniel and very simple and basic plots by Larry Hama. Unfortunately, the tone of the series didn't quite work, especially coming right after No Man's Land, one of the darkest and most serious Batman storylines ever. Without a doubt, the kid-friendly approach to the Batman title failed, mostly because readers had grown up and they wanted more mature storytelling, which is why Detective Comics did a lot better. In this new era, Detective Comics focused on serious and mature stories written by Greg Rucka, with a cinematic approach to the art by Sean Martinbrough. The stories in Detective Comics were primarily detective mysteries, where Batman would work alongside the GCPD to solve murders and other violent crimes. The series was heavily inspired by film noir movies, featuring seductive femme fatales and a limited color palette that resembled the old black and white films, creating a unique visual style that DC Comics labeled as crime noir. The storytelling style in Detective Comics was quite different from the one in the Batman title, but both series showcased Batman as a solo crime fighter. In order to showcase Batman working alongside the extensive members of the Bat family, DC created a new series called Batman: Gotham Knights. The series was written by Devin Grayson, and it featured Batman alongside all of his allies, including Robin, Nightwing, Oracle, Azrael, Batgirl, and Catwoman. The majority of these characters also had their own comic book series, and on top of that, Batman had many other spin-offs, miniseries, and graphic novels. The Batman line of comics was quite extensive, but not always relevant, so for the sake of consistency in this video, we're only taking a look at the main Batman comics and a few of the other most relevant publications. Now, with all of these changes and all of the creative teams in place, it seemed like DC Comics had the ideal roadmap for Batman in the new millennium. Except that nobody expected what happened next, showing that even the best laid plans of Batman often go awry. The new Gotham era had been carefully planned to be a new beginning, a rebirth of the Batman comics with new ideas and new stories, but it all quickly went south because DC Comics was falling apart behind the scenes. The creative mastermind behind New Gotham was the Batman editor Denny O'Neil, who had been in charge of the Batman comics for close to 15 years. O'Neill's time in the Batman comics is widely considered the best era in the history of Batman, but unfortunately his legacy was cut short due to health issues and major corporate changes happening at DC Comics. Because of all these, Denny O'Neil was forced to retire in 2001, much earlier than he had expected, and the editorial duties of the Batman comics were passed on to other people, who had no clear idea how to continue the work of O'Neil and were not even interested in doing so, according to the creative teams at the time. In my personal opinion, Denny O'Neil was the last great Batman editor, the last person who was a storyteller first and foremost, something that showed in his excellent track record of creating the most engaging Batman continuity during the 90s, with the stories that were meaningful and which were always connected between one another. As the Batman editor, O'Neil was able to get all sorts of talented creators with different opinions and ideas and managed to make them work together as a unit with one clear vision of who Batman was and what his comics were meant to be. None of the Batman editors that have come after O'Neil have managed to do the same whatsoever, and the absence of Denny O'Neil was most notable in the early 2000s, immediately after his retirement. When that moment came, the creative teams Denny had put together were at a loss of how to continue. Their guiding light was gone, and this lack of leadership was soon reflected in the next storyline, called Batman: Officer Down, a short story where Commissioner Gordon is shot and seriously wounded, forcing him to retire. At the same time, DC published Batman Turning Point, a 5-issue miniseries showcasing the relationship of Batman and Commissioner Gordon, starting with Year 1 and ending with No Man's Land, which are also the first and last big Batman storylines, edited by Denny O'Neil. There is no doubt in my mind that both Officer Down and Turning Points were created as a well-deserved homage to Denny O'Neil. However, these stories were indeed a turning point, because Officer Down opened the doors to big changes, like removing Commissioner Gordon, who had been a vital part of the Batman comics since the start. That was a major change, and the status quo was no longer the same. Like this, Commissioner Gordon became the first domino piece to fall, and started a chain reaction of questionable stories at best and absolutely awful ones at worst. The Batman comics were off to an awful start to the new decade, and in 2001 the new editors started making a lot of changes to the comics, bringing the whole New Gotham era to a weird ending. First of all, the Batman title got a new writer as they hired Ed Brubaker, who was best known for his work in crime comics. Unfortunately, he had to follow the style that was already established in the main Batman series, creating action-adventure stories with colorful and simple plots. And it's pretty obvious that these kinds of stories were not Brubaker's strongest suit, as many of them are simply not interesting or exciting. These are not bad stories by any means, they are just forgettable. Take for example the brand new villain he created called Zeiss, a mercenary who uses special goggles that allows him to fight on the same level as Batman. However, besides his gimmick goggles, there was nothing special about Zeiss, and despite how much Brubaker used this villain in almost all of his Batman stories, nobody else used this character ever again. Meanwhile, Detective Comics was also changed. Commissioner Gordon had retired, so the Batman dynamics with the GCPD were broken, and all of the detective and crime stories came to an end. The whole crime noir approach to the series was no longer there, and instead DC Comics introduced a new character called Sasha Bordeaux. Sasha was introduced as the bodyguard of Bruce Wayne, but over a couple of issues she slowly started to become a potential romantic interest for Bruce, changing the whole dynamic of Detective Comics and turning it into a melodramatic series, far from the crime and detective comic it was meant to be. Something similar happened to Gotham Knights, as writer Devin Grayson had to wrap up the first big storyline in a hurry in order to start new stories with a new direction. Instead of showcasing Batman working with all of his other allies, Gotham Knights became another solo Batman series with only occasional appearances of the Bat family. Slowly but surely, the Batman creative teams lost direction, and some of the stories they came up with were very questionable, like in the Robin comic, where Batman decided to tell a spoiler the secret identity of Robin without consulting with Tim first. Meanwhile, in the Catwoman comic, Selina and Nightwing have a really intense, passionate, and weird makeout session. Without the guidance of a proper editor, the writers inserted their own ideas without any concern for continuity or characterization. In fact, the new Batman editors were only concerned about creating stories that sounded good, and if they just happened to be actually good, then that was just a bonus. One example of that is the Catwoman reboot of 2002, as writer Ed Brubaker and artist Darwin Cook reimagined and redesigned Catwoman. This was a risky move, because they had to cancel the previous Catwoman series first, and then introduce a radically different version. Fortunately, it was the greatest thing that could happen to Catwoman, showing that this was a good idea and it succeeded because it had a great execution. But then there were those stories that sounded like a good idea, but they were absolutely not, like Batman: The Dark Knight Strikes Again. Back in 2001, DC Comics had the brilliant idea of having Frank Miller, one of the most influential Batman writers of all time, back on Batman, and creating a sequel to his legendary graphic novel, The Dark Knight Returns. This was nothing short of genius, it was a no-brainer, but what nobody expected was that Frank Miller would intentionally create one of the most horrendous Batman comics ever. The Dark Knight Strikes Again, or DK2, is nothing short of an abomination. As a sequel to The Dark Knight Returns, this one falls short of the original in every single aspect. The story is pure nonsense and the art is atrocious, leaving a lot of fans confused and angry. This infamous graphic novel is the result of the new approach by the Batman editors and DC Comics, who started prioritizing the marketing potential of a comic rather than its actual storytelling value. Another example of that is the next big storyline, called Batman: Bruce Wayne Fugitive. The whole idea behind it is that Bruce Wayne is framed for murder, and after being arrested, he breaks out of prison to clear his own name. As an idea, it sounds awesome, but the execution sadly doesn't match the idea. The story opens with Bruce and Sasha, who is now also the new Batman sidekick, going into Wayne Manor and finding the dead body of Vesper Fairchild, one of the love interests of Bruce from back in the 90s. Vesper had been recently brought back in Detective Comics to create a love triangle between her, Bruce, and Sasha, which ultimately didn't go anywhere when they decided to kill Vesper at the start of this new story. The GCPD then conveniently arrive at the crime scene at the right moment to arrest Bruce and Sasha, and then, for the entire first half of the storyline, Bruce spends all the time in prison, being interrogated, analyzed, beaten and tortured, while he does absolutely nothing to save himself or to allow his friends and family to help him. It's like 10 chapters of Bruce being dead inside, with no will to fight whatsoever. Bruce became a shell of a man, and in the second half of the story, when he finally decides to break out of prison and become Batman, he doesn't even care about solving the mystery, clearing his own name, or helping Sasha, who was still locked up in prison. Batman was so broken that he doubled down on this idea of isolating himself and rejecting his identity as Bruce Wayne, all of which led to an unnecessary fight with Nightwing before leaving everything behind. Batman then spent another 10 chapters doing anything else except solving the mystery, until he finally remembered his parents in Crime Alley, which he should have never forgotten in the first place, and only then he came to his senses and cleared his name at last. Bruce Wayne Fugitive is an okay storyline, with some interesting ideas but a lot of dull moments that could have been avoided or improved if the story was shorter, or Batman was a bit more involved and reasonable instead of being broken 90% of the time. Bruce Wayne Fugitive was also the final story by the original creative teams behind the new Gotham project. Following that story, a lot of changes started happening, like Ed Brubaker becoming the main writer of Detective Comics. In this new chapter, Brubaker was finally able to create serious and dark stories, which were much better than his work in the Batman title. And the best story of this era is called Made of Wood, where Batman has to track down a serial killer with help from the original Green Lantern. The story is a fantastic murder mystery, and it's made even better thanks to the great art of Patrick Searcher and the rest of the visual team, who managed to give the story the right atmosphere, full of darkness and a real sense of danger, lurking in the shadows. Ed Brubaker was clearly a great writer under the right circumstances, and only 1 year later, in 2003, he teamed up with writer Greg Rucka and artist Michael Lark to launch a new comic called Gotham Central. This new series was completely focused on the Gotham City Police Department, showing how the cops and detectives deal with the vicious criminals of Gotham. The idea behind the series was to showcase the GCPD working without Batman, and in that sense, the series is all about police procedure. The writers approached the series as a work of crime and noir fiction, with the artists doing their part and illustrating it with a very dark and realistic approach. The idea of Gotham as a bright and modern city was abandoned, and this series brought back the darkness to Gotham City. Gotham Central is a great series, as it shows us how Gotham works for the normal people and the sacrifices that it takes to be a cop in a city as dark and rotten as Gotham. Batman is almost never here, and that's the best thing about it. The only real character that is missing is Gordon, because without him the GCPD feels very strange. Now, even though Gotham Central was an interesting idea, it was never among the best-selling comics. What the Batman fans wanted was good old-fashioned Batman action, and DC Comics delivered just that in 2003, dominating the comic book market of that year with the iconic and always controversial Batman Hush. This massive project started way back in 2001, when the art director for DC Comics, Mark Chiarello, suggested bringing together two of the most popular comic book creators to make an epic Batman storyline. This is how DC got Jeff Loeb to write the story and Jim Lee to do the art of the main Batman title in the fall of 2002. This brand new story was called Batman Hush, and it was an instant success. It was the kind of exciting story and awesome art that Batman needed since the start of the decade. The story was created as a showcase of all the major characters in the Batman mythos, and like that, it became a great starting point for new readers to get introduced into the Batman comics. To this day, Batman Hush remains one of the most successful and popular Batman stories, thanks to the eye-catching art of Jim Lee and the multiple fan service moments all throughout the storyline. However, despite how successful it is, Hush has also been heavily criticized for the convoluted storytelling and the terrible revelation of Hush as the new villain. That, however, was not the creative team's fault entirely, but rather the corporate team at DC Comics. Jeff Loeb had said multiple times that he was hired to write Hush under the condition that he would create a brand new Batman villain. Apparently, his original idea was to bring back Jason Todd and introduce him as the main villain, which would explain why the revelation of Jason Todd works so perfectly, and why the character of Hush feels extremely forced and awful. Now, despite the mixed critical reception, Hush was a tremendous commercial success, taking the Batman comics to the top of the sales charts every month in 2003. This success, however, came at a price, because Batman Hush is a story that changed the Batman comics on a fundamental level. By the end of the story, the secret identity of Batman was no longer a secret, as both Catwoman and the Riddler discover that he is Bruce Wayne. Harvey Dent also got his face restored, taking Two-Face out of the picture, and by the end of the story, they decide to kill Harold and leave the door open for the eventual return of Jason Todd. That was a huge turning point for Batman, because it meant that death was no longer a serious issue in these comics. The death of Jason Todd back in 1988 was a landmark in the history of Batman, a meaningful moment that fundamentally changed the Batman comics. It was a character-defining moment for Batman that haunted him for years, and allowed us to think that death in the Batman mythos had serious consequences, that it had repercussions. But all of that changed when Jason Todd was brought back in Batman Hush, and the success of that story got DC all excited about experimenting with death in the Batman comics. Before, they had only killed minor characters like Harold or Vesper Fairchild, but now that death didn't matter anymore, they went all out and started killing everyone, starting with the one character that, ironically, never actually dies. In 2003 and 2004, DC Comics published Batman, Death and the Maidens, a miniseries where the immortal Ra's al Ghul finally dies for good when he is killed by his first daughter, a new character called Nyssa. The whole idea behind this story was to completely get rid of Ra's al Ghul and instead have Nyssa take over the League of Assassins. And in that sense, that story is absolutely pointless, because it tries to convince us that Ra's al Ghul is finally dead and gone, while at the same time it has a whole sequence that lasts for 3 issues of Nyssa kidnapping her sister, Talia, drugging her and stripping her naked in order to kill her, before throwing her body into the Lazarus pit and bringing her back to life, just to repeat the same process, over and over and over. In other words, this story shows us repeatedly that dead people can come back to life through the Lazarus pit, defeating the whole purpose of killing Ra's in the most sadistic and violent way possible. This whole sequence that brutally destroys a beloved character like Talia is unnecessarily violent and brutal, and once again, it was all a decision made by the corporate team at DC Comics, who started pushing their writers and artists to create darker and edgier stories for the sake of shock value. This story is a perfect example of how corporate meddling ruins everything it touches. Another example of that is the series Gotham Knights, which was ruined when DC Comics decided to turn that series into a showcase of Hush. After finally getting the brand new Batman villain that they asked for, the corporate heads at DC then wanted to use him as much as possible, so they changed Gotham Knights, removing the Batman family from the series and shoehorning Hush into every single chapter. In this new era, a normal story in Gotham Knights would go something like this. One of the classic Batman villains shows up, then Batman shows up to stop him, and then Hush shows up to join whatever may be happening. The story could be about the Joker or Clayface or the Riddler. It doesn't really matter, because Hush would always find a way to get in there. It's actually ridiculous how terrible all of these stories are. In one story, the Joker puts a bomb in Hush's heart, and in another story, Hush and Batman get in a love triangle with Poison Ivy. These stories would be funny, except they are not comedy. In fact, they are dead serious, so much so that by the end of this story, Poison Ivy is killed in another example of pointless deaths. Gotham Knights was eventually cancelled in the mid-2000s, but the damage was already done. Poison Ivy and Ra's al Ghul were dead, Two-Face no longer existed, and the Riddler was exiled because he knew too much. The Rogues Gallery was dying, and the Batman comics would continue to go on a downward spiral of darkness, death, and destruction. But before all that happened, there were at least some good news for Batman. By the mid-2000s, Warner Bros. Started a conscious effort to bring Batman back to the mainstream media. It had been far too long since Batman had a proper animated series, so in 2004 they released The Batman, a brand new animated show featuring a new Batman for the younger generations of the new millennium. The series explored the growth and evolution of a very young and hip Batman, starting out during his early days as a solitary vigilante fighting new and dangerous villains. And over the course of 4 years, 5 seasons and 1 movie, the series showcased all the major events in Batman's life, like the first appearances of Batgirl, Robin, and the Justice League. The series became best known for its unique character designs, as Batman, the Joker, the Riddler, and everyone else was given cool new designs by artist Jeff Matsuda, making them all look edgy and badass in order to sell toys, which is why the series was so successful in keeping Batman relevant among kids of that era. The Batman was a perfect blend of light and darkness, with serious but fun adventures, and the main Batman comics took a bit of inspiration from that series. In 2004, Judd Winnick became the new Batman writer, and his first storyline was called As the Crow Flies. The story follows Batman tracking down a serial killer who has been butchering the gangsters of Gotham. Eventually, it's revealed that the killer is the Scarecrow, who had developed a new chemical that allowed himself to turn into a monster full of rage and bloodlust. This very underrated Batman story deserves a lot more recognition, because it features the same kind of dark and exciting adventures from the Batman animated show, and it looks equally great thanks to the art of Dustin Nguyen. But perhaps the most important thing about the story is that it is a great prelude to the actual return of Jason Todd. Following that storyline, Judd Winnick teamed up with artist Doug Mahnke, and they presented Batman Under the Hood, the official reintroduction of Jason Todd under the new identity of Red Hood. Under the Hood is one of the better Batman stories of that era, and with good reason. The story does an excellent job of reintroducing Jason as a violent and evil murderer, becoming one of the best Batman villains ever. It's no wonder that to this day, Under the Hood is considered the only good Red Hood story, because nobody else has managed to understand and grasp the concept of Jason better than Judd Winnick. In 2004, Batman was clearly picking up momentum, and in 2005, a new chapter for The Dark Knight was about to begin, when Warner Bros. Finally brought back the cinematic Batman franchise. After the collapse of the Batman movies in the 90s, Warner Bros. Spent years trying to find the right way to bring Batman back to the big screen. When word about this reached the young film director Christopher Nolan, he pitched an idea for a new Batman movie, one that had nothing to do with the previous ones, and it would bring a serious and hyper-realistic take on the Dark Knight. Warner Bros. Had found what they needed, and Batman Begins was released in 2005. The movie is a complete origin story that reintroduced Batman to the mainstream audiences. The role of Batman was played by Christian Bale, and the movie also introduced the classic villains Scarecrow and Ra's al Ghul for the first time in live action. Batman Begins was a big success, and it was mostly thanks to the comics. A lot of the concepts and ideas in this movie were directly taken from comics like Year One, The Man Who Falls, Strange Apparitions, and many other Batman comics. At first glance, Batman Begins might look like a very grounded and realistic movie, but deep down, it's a very comic-accurate film. Batman Begins not only drew a lot of inspiration from the classic Batman comics, but the movie also inspired the modern comics. Unfortunately, that was not a good thing, because DC Comics misunderstood this movie so badly that they went on to destroy the Batman comics. In 2004 and 2005, the Batman editors and the corporate heads at DC decided to bring the style of Batman Begins into the comics, and in order to do it, they set out to tear down the Batman mythos. This is how they came up with Batman War Games, the most ambitious storyline of the mid-2000s. In Batman War Games, Batman and all of his allies have to stop the biggest gang war the city has ever seen. A gang war that started because spoilers set in motion one of Batman's convoluted plans behind his back, and it completely backfired, taking Gotham down a path of death and destruction like never before. This is a story where the heroes fail in the end, and the criminals take control of the city, with Black Mask becoming the undisputed crime lord of Gotham and the most dangerous Batman villain ever. In this story, Black Mask kills Spoiler and Orpheus, the newest member of the Bat family, before blowing up the Watchtower, destroying Oracle's base of operations. Black Mask becomes so violent and ruthless that the other Batman villains like the Penguin are forced to leave Gotham. Batman also gets exposed on television as the man behind the gang war, becoming like this the public enemy number one, a wanted criminal who now has to fight the GCPD. And as if that wasn't bad enough already, Batman's friends and allies decide to leave Gotham as well, leaving Batman alone, which is exactly what DC wanted to make the Batman comics similar to Batman Begins, making everything look brown and turning Batman back to being a solo vigilante. Batman War Games was not about telling a great story, it was about creating the biggest defeat for Batman and separate him from everyone else by any means necessary. For that reason, War Games is a terrible story, but the worst thing about it has to be the death of a spoiler. In the story, Black Mask beats and tortures a spoiler in the most graphic and violent moment of the story, that ends with a young girl dying. Back in 2004, this is what DC Comics thought was a good story, and it was a major problem across the company. Also in 2004, DC published the big crossover event of the year called Identity Crisis, a story that showcases dark and awful themes such as violent death and sexual assault. This is the story where Tim Drake loses his dad after he is murdered, and it happens right around the same time as his girlfriend is also killed. Shortly after that, DC also turned Batgirl into a killer, in a clear case of character assassination just to cancel her series. And finally, Nightwing was also raped in his own title by this nasty character called Tarantula. And that was the good ending, because one of these executives at DC originally wanted Nightwing to die. The Batman comics had never been so awful and dark before, and DC tripled down on this madness, taking Batman down to his lowest point ever in 2005, when they released the beautiful train wreck known as All-Star Batman and Robin. This is a comic that needs no introduction. Everyone knows about the goddamn Batman, the deranged lunatic that kidnaps a 12-year-old boy and mistreats him to the point of telling him to eat rats. All-Star Batman and Robin is perhaps the worst Batman comic ever. Not even the great art of Jim Lee could save the random nonsense and excessive violence that Frank Miller was going on about. The obsession that DC Comics had with making everything dark and edgy had finally reached a breaking point, and Batman hit rock bottom. By the mid-2000s, the Batman comics were drowning in darkness, but a wise man once said that the night is darkest just before the dawn, and thankfully, the dawn was finally coming. 2006, DC Comics realized they had a big problem, and in order to fix it, they created 1 year later, a big project that involved all the comics of the company. The idea behind 1 year later was to create a time jump of exactly 1 year, where the big characters like Superman and Batman would go missing. The reasons for their disappearance and the explanations of what they did in that time were explored in the series called 52, but the main comics of each character would feature brand new storylines that took place after the missing year. For Batman, that story was called Face the Face, and thanks to the 1 year later project, this story worked as a soft reboot in order to undo a lot of the damage done over the previous 5 years. First of all, there was a complete editorial overhaul, removing the people who allowed all that darkness to happen and focusing back on telling good stories and bringing back core characters of the Batman mythos. The first ones to come back were Harvey Bullock and a rejuvenated Commissioner Gordon, bringing him out of retirement with a very simple explanation. Bullock had discovered a deep network of corruption in the GCPD, getting everyone fired and reinstating Gordon back to his old job. And any similarities to what happened to the previous Batman editors is purely coincidental. With Gordon back in Gotham, Batman went back to work with the GCPD alongside Robin, who also got a new red outfit, and their first mission together was to bring down Poison Ivy, who is also back from the dead without any explanation whatsoever. DC Comics started changing back a lot of things, ignoring the awful comics of the past and undoing things that didn't work, like Harvey Dent, who had his face restored in 2003 and nobody did anything with that. After Batman Hush, nobody had any idea what to do or was interested in doing stories with Harvey Dent, so they just decided to have him destroy his own face at the end of this story and bring back Two-Face. Despite the fact that Face the Face brought back many characters, it also got rid of some others, killing a bunch of minor villains like the KG Beast, Magpie, and unfortunately my favorite Batman villain, the Ventriloquist. The good news is that this was the final chapter of the darkness and death in the 2000s, and after this story, nothing was ever the same. After Face the Face in 2006, DC Comics made the biggest and most important change of the decade when they hired Paul Dini and Grant Morrison as the new Batman writers. Together, Dini and Morrison ushered in a new era in the Batman comics, a new chapter where characters were created instead of killed, and the history of Batman was celebrated instead of destroyed. This was the actual reconstruction of the Batman comics that was so desperately needed, and it also happened because the corporate dudes at DC finally stopped micromanaging the comics, giving the writers all the freedom to tell the stories they wanted to tell. This is how we got an amazing run in Detective Comics, where Paul Dini, alongside artist Don Kramer, created standalone chapters where Batman had to confront new villains, like the new ventriloquist, or he teamed up with old ones, like the Riddler, who now became a private detective. In order to bring back the Riddler, Paul Dini used the 1 year later idea to explain that Riddler had been in a coma for a whole year, and now he had a convenient case of amnesia, forgetting all about Batman being Bruce Wayne. Detective Comics was a really fun series, with Batman fighting classic villains like the Joker, Poison Ivy and Harley Quinn, with help of Robin, the Riddler and even Satana. The series was a breath of fresh air, and while Paul Dini revitalized the Batman mythos, Grant Morrison was changing it altogether. The work of Grant Morrison and artist Andy Kubert in the main Batman title was groundbreaking to say the least. Together they introduced the biggest and most significant change to the Batman comics when they created Damian in the story called Batman and Son. Then they also brought back Ra's al Ghul, undoing and ignoring the awful story where he died. The Ra's al Ghul family was quite important in this run, despite the horrible characterization of Talia. But even more important than them were the Black Glove and Dr. Hurt, the new big Batman villains that Morrison created in order to do the most fascinating thing ever, to make sense of the entire history of Batman and make everything canon. Of course, this was not an easy task, and for the most part, things ended up becoming quite confusing and convoluted. A lot of times you would need a guide to explain the dozens of references to the older Batman comics, but that's precisely what makes this run so special, because it works as a beautiful homage to everything that came before, honoring the legacy of Batman and the creators that made it happen. For far too long, Batman had been dwelling in darkness, and all of this was just a natural reaction to change all of that. By 2008, the Batman fans were ready to appreciate not just Batman's dark side, but also his colorful and forgotten side. This was already happening in the Grant Morrison comics, as well as the new Superman Batman series, finally bringing back together the world's finest team. But it was all taken to a whole new level, thanks to the new animated series called Batman, the Brave and the Bold. This show was a great homage to the Batman comics of the Silver Age, bringing back the bright and light-hearted Batman, who could have a good time while saving the day, along with his friends from all over the DC universe. It was a perfect love letter to the silly and wacky stories from the 1950s and 1960s, taking direct inspiration from these classic comics and introducing them to a new generation of kid Bat fans. However, as much as this show was focused on the lighter and colorful Batman, it's important to acknowledge that there is one episode with the dark and violent Batman. It is called Chill of the Night, and it's by far the most popular and beloved episode of the whole series. And it's important because it means that even though there was a newfound appreciation for the colorful Batman, there is no denying that the serious version of Batman is still the most effective version. And this point was proven beyond the shadow of a bat when Warner Bros. Released the highly anticipated sequel to Batman Begins. The Dark Knight was released in the summer of 2008, and it was more than just a movie. It was a life-changing experience, a turning point for Batman fans everywhere and the biggest Batman film ever created. It's very hard not to be hyperbolic about this movie, because everything about it was huge, from the viral marketing campaign to the breaking of every box office record and the generational performance of Heath Ledger as the Joker. The Dark Knight did everything right. But the best thing about it, in my opinion, are the countless references to the Batman comics. If Batman Begins was already a decent adaptation of many classic Batman comics, The Dark Knight takes it up to 11, adapting elements from the more popular comics like The Long Halloween, The Dark Knight Returns, and The Killing Joke, but also taking things from the more obscure and forgotten stories like Batman #1, Strange Apparitions, and also Dark Detective, a Joker story from 2005 that The Dark Knight took perhaps a bit too much from. Nevertheless, it's precisely that what makes this movie so special, and thanks to The Dark Knight, the late 2000s became a beautiful time to be a Batman fan, because on top of having Paul Dini and Grant Morrison in the comics, Batman had recovered his great reputation in the mainstream media thanks to a wonderful animated series and a phenomenal movie. Batman was officially back, but even after all of that success, the comeback was not quite over yet. Batman had already conquered the comics, television and movies in the past, but now it was time for something else, something new. The final frontier for Batman, the final storytelling medium where The Dark Knight had never found real success before. Now it was time for Batman to take over the video games. Batman video games had existed for as long as video games themselves, but despite having games for almost every generation of consoles, there had never been a Batman game that managed to achieve mainstream success. In 2008, however, Warner Bros. Released LEGO Batman, the video game, a kid-friendly game that was yet another example of the Batman fanbase embracing the brighter side of the Dark Knight. The game proved popular enough that it got 2 more sequels in the 2010s, with a 4th game being recently announced for 2026. Even though the gameplay and the story were pretty basic, LEGO Batman, the video game, was the first real win for the Dark Knight in the world of video games. But just like it happened in the movies and television, the real success would only come when the Batman video games went dark and serious, which happened the following year in 2009, when Warner Bros. Released Batman: Arkham Asylum. This groundbreaking video game was created by Rocksteady, a fairly new and small video game developer company that wanted to create the most authentic Batman experience, and they succeeded. Arkham Asylum is a game that perfectly captures what it's like to be Batman. From solving puzzles and mysteries by following clues and doing detective work, to the groundbreaking combat system that revolutionized the superhero genre in video games. Playing Arkham Asylum truly feels like stepping into one of the best Batman comics, thanks to the breathtaking visuals of the asylum, combined with a gothic horror atmosphere that fits perfectly with a Batman that strikes from the shadows, attacking like a dark creature of the night and striking fear in the hearts of his enemies. Thanks to all of that and the return of Kevin Conroy as Batman, Mark Hamill as the Joker and Arlene Sorkin as Harley, Arkham Asylum proved to be a huge success, becoming one of the best video games ever made. But perhaps the most important reason for the success of Arkham Asylum was the story, which was written by Paul Dini, and it was based on the Arkham Asylum graphic novel from 1989, written by Grant Morrison. In other words, Arkham Asylum was pretty much written by the 2 people in charge of the Batman comics at the time. By 2009, Batman had finally conquered all of the mainstream media thanks to The Dark Knight, The Brave and the Bold and Arkham Asylum, and the Batman comics were entering the final and most groundbreaking chapter of the decade. Over in Detective Comics, Paul Dini and artist Dustin Nguyen started one of the most iconic storylines of this era, bringing Hush back to the spotlight and creating what is widely considered the best Hush story, called Batman: Heart of Hush. In this story, Paul Dini does what nobody else could, fleshing out Hush and turning him into an interesting character, allowing us to understand his motivations as well as his character design, by revealing that Hush wore bandages all over his head because he was turning his face into that of Bruce Wayne. Heart of Hush is the final chapter of Paul Dini's run in Detective Comics, and it's truly amazing to see just how vital his work was for the success of Batman in the late 2000s. Paul Dini had a hand in everything, writing some of the best Batman comics of the decade as well as some of the best episodes of The Brave and the Bold, and at the same time writing the story of Arkham Asylum. And that right there is precisely why I believe Paul Dini is the best modern Batman writer. Meanwhile, Grant Morrison was also crafting the grand finale to one of the most iconic Batman runs ever, with Batman facing his biggest challenge against the Black Glove and Dr. Hurt. This epic climax in Arkham Asylum was created as the final Batman story, because following this fight, Morrison decided to do the unthinkable and officially killed Batman. It happened in the Final Crisis storyline, where Batman confronts Darkseid and dies. Even though death in the Batman comics was meaningless now, DC Comics actually tried to make this one meaningful, keeping Batman dead and giving him a metafictional funeral in the story called Whatever Happened to the Caped Crusader. In 2009, Batman was officially dead, and this allowed DC to start a new chapter in the Batman comics, where Dick Grayson, Nightwing, becomes the new Batman. This was the natural evolution, with Nightwing picking up the cape and cowl where Bruce had left it, taking up the responsibility of being the protector of Gotham. The decade was coming to an end with this exciting new era called Batman Reborn, which also changed things dramatically in the Batman comics. Old series like Robin and Nightwing were cancelled in order to make room for new series like Batman and Robin and The Streets of Gotham. These series were written by Paul Dini and Grant Morrison respectively, and they showcased Dick Grayson working alongside Damian as his new Robin, teaching him how to become a proper crime fighter. The rest of the Batman family also got a big makeover, with Tim Drake adopting the identity of Red Robin and Spoiler picking up the mantle of Batgirl, both of them in their own comics. The Catwoman title and the Birds of Prey comic were both cancelled, but in their place DC introduced Gotham City Sirens, a series exclusively dedicated to the girls of Gotham like Catwoman, Poison Ivy and Harley Quinn. And there was also Detective Comics, which now became a series about Batwoman, a new version of Kathy Kane, who first appeared back in 2006 during the 52 series. When Batman went missing for a whole year during the 1 year later event, Batwoman was there to protect Gotham, and now she was the main character of Detective Comics. And last but not least, there was the main Batman title, which was written by Judd Winnick at first and then by Tony Daniel. This was a solo Batman series, where Dick Grayson slowly grows into the role of Batman, dealing with the consequences that come with it. It's the perfect showcase of the growth and evolution that Dick Grayson has to go through in order to realize that he can never truly replace Bruce. All he can do is become a different Batman. A Batman who smiles and talks. The actual Batman who laughs. The 2000s were a crazy chapter in the history of Batman, and this is how it all came to an end, with a big smile on Batman's face. The difference between how Batman started the decade and how it ended is night and day. At the start, DC promised a rebirth of the Batman mythos that for many reasons didn't happen, and things only got worse before they finally got better, proving that the night is truly darkest just before the dawn. But the dawn came, and Batman was finally reborn. Every decade in the history of Batman has ups and downs. It's something that's always happened since 1939, but there's only one decade where the bad moments were abysmal and the good ones were extraordinary. It was the decade when Batman fell down in order to pick himself up like never before, becoming a cornerstone of pop culture for generations to come. This was the decade that literally and metaphorically killed Batman, only to bring him back stronger than ever. And that is what I love about the downfall and comeback of Batman in the 2000s. Thank you all so much for watching this video. I had a blast doing this one, and I hope you had a good time watching it as much as I had making it. As always, a massive thanks to all of my patrons, and a special thanks to Thomas Morey, Wall Scalar Batman, John Papp, Marco Daniel, Kay, MP, Chris Tishuk, Marcus DC, Mike Von Doom, Diego, and Javier Rodriguez Camacho. Thank you all for your support, and I will see you in the next one.